Jake wiped the sweat off his brow as he slid out from under the rusted old truck he'd been working on all morning. His back ached, his hands were stained with grease, and the smell of oil seemed to cling to him no matter how much he scrubbed. This was his life, long hours in a run-down garage in the middle of a struggling neighborhood. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and Jake took pride in that. The sound of a car sputtering to a stop outside the garage broke his focus. He glanced up, surprised to see a sleek black sedan parked haphazardly at the curb. It was the kind of car that didn't belong in this part of town, and neither did the woman stepping out of it. She was young, polished, and clearly out of her element. Her heels clicked nervously against the cracked concrete as she approached. "Hello, is anyone here?" she called out, her voice sharp and tinged with panic. Jake stood, wiping his hands on his already grease-stained overalls. "You're in the right place," he said, keeping his tone neutral. The contrast between her designer outfit and the dingy surroundings wasn't lost on him. "My car broke down," she said, gesturing to the sedan. "Can you fix it? I'm in a hurry." Jake raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Pop the hood. Let me take a look." She hesitated, glancing at her phone like she had somewhere more important to be. "Can you fix it quickly? I'm on a tight schedule." "Let me see what I'm working with first," Jake replied, grabbing his tools. He had no idea that this seemingly ordinary encounter was about to change his life forever. Jake leaned over the open hood of the sleek black sedan, his experienced eyes scanning the engine. It didn't take long for him to spot the problem. The radiator was nearly bone dry, and a few connections were loose. He shook his head slightly, muttering to himself. Whoever had been maintaining this car clearly didn't know what they were doing. "You've got a dry radiator and some loose connections," Jake said, glancing over at the woman. She was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, shifting uncomfortably in her high heels. "When's the last time you had this thing serviced?" She bit her lip, looking slightly embarrassed. I don't know. I don't really handle that kind of stuff." Jake suppressed a grin. "Figures," he said under his breath, though not unkindly. "I can fix it, but it's going to take a couple of hours." "A couple of hours?" she groaned, pacing back and forth. "I don't have that kind of time. Can't you do it faster?" Jake straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Look, lady, I'm not a magician. If you want it done right, it's going to take time." She sighed heavily, clearly frustrated, but eventually nodded. "Fine. I'll wait." Jake got to work, tuning out her impatient pacing and the occasional sound of her phone buzzing. He was used to this kind of thing, people who didn't understand the work it took to fix something properly. But there was something about her that intrigued him. She didn't seem like the type to end up in a place like this, and yet here she was, standing in his garage, looking completely out of place. By the time Jake finished, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, orange glow over the garage. He stood up, stretching his sore back, and called out to her. "All done?" She looked up from her phone, relief washing over her face. "Finally," she said, walking over to him. "Thank you. How much do I owe you?" Jake gave her a modest number, one that barely covered the parts and labor. She blinked, then reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick wad of cash. Without counting, she handed him far more than he'd asked for. "Keep the change," she said curtly, already turning toward her car. Jake stared at the money in his hand, stunned. "That's too much," he called after her. "I can't take this." "Consider it a tip," she replied over her shoulder, sliding into the driver's seat. Before Jake could protest further, the engine roared to life and she drove off, the sound of her car fading into the evening air. Jake stood there for a moment, still holding the cash, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He'd seen all kinds of people come through his garage, but she was different. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He shook his head, slipping the money into his pocket. "Weird day," he muttered to himself, heading back inside to clean up. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. Later that evening, Jake finally had a moment to relax. He sank into the worn-out couch in his small living room, a cold beer in one hand and the TV remote in the other. The day had been long, and the strange encounter with the woman in her fancy car still lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye, but he chalked it up to his imagination. People like her didn't cross paths with people like him, not for long anyway. Just as he was about to settle in and watch the game, a sharp knock at the door startled him. Jake frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late, and he wasn't expecting anyone. Setting his beer down, he got up and opened the door cautiously. Standing on his porch was a man in a crisp black suit, holding a sleek leather briefcase. He looked completely out of place in Jake's modest neighborhood, his polished shoes gleaming under the dim porch light. "Jake Miller?" the man asked, his tone professional but unreadable. Yeah," Jake replied warily. "Who's asking?" The man extended an envelope toward him. "I'm here on behalf of Miss Sophia Bennett." Jake blinked, the name not immediately registering. "Sophia Bennett?" he repeated, confused. "The woman whose car you repaired earlier today," the man clarified. Jake's brow furrowed. "Is something wrong with the repair? I told her everything should be running fine now." "It's not about the repair," the man said, his tone calm but firm. "Miss Bennett asked me to deliver this to you personally. She has a rather unconventional way of expressing her gratitude." Jake hesitated, his gut twisting with suspicion. He took the envelope cautiously, his rough, grease-stained hands a stark contrast to the smooth, expensive paper. "What's this?" he asked, eyeing the man. "Open it," the man replied simply. Jake stepped back into the house, the man waiting silently on the porch. He tore open the envelope, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't explain. Inside was a check. His eyes widened as he read the amount. $50,000. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake muttered, staring at the check like it might disappear. "This has to be a mistake." "No mistake," the man assured him, stepping inside uninvited. He glanced around Jake's modest living room, his gaze lingering briefly on the peeling wallpaper and second-hand furniture. "Miss Bennett has her reasons." Jake looked up, his suspicion growing. "What reasons? I fixed her car, not her entire life." The man's lips curved into a faint smile. "Miss Bennett values acts of kindness, especially from those who expect nothing in return. She believes in rewarding people who go above and beyond." Jake stared at the check again, his mind racing. $50,000 was more money than he'd ever seen in his life, let alone held in his hands. It could pay off his debts, fix up the shop, maybe even give him a chance to dream a little bigger. But it didn't sit right with him. People didn't just hand out money like this, not without a catch. "What's the condition?" Jake asked, his voice wary. "There is no condition," the man replied smoothly. "It's a gift, pure and simple." Jake didn't believe him, not entirely. People like Sophia Bennett didn't throw around money for no reason. Still, he nodded, slipping the check back into the envelope. "If she's looking for more car repairs, she knows where to find me," he said, trying to keep things light. The man gave a polite nod and turned to leave. "Enjoy your evening, Mr. Miller, and take care." Jake closed the door behind him, leaning against it as he stared at the envelope in his hand. His life had always been simple, predictable, but now, for the first time in years, he felt like something was shifting, something big, The next morning, Jake was back at the garage, trying to shake off the strange events of the previous night. The check sat untouched on his kitchen counter, and he hadn't decided what to do with it yet. Part of him wanted to cash it immediately. $50,000 could change everything. But another part of him couldn't help but feel uneasy. Nothing in life came for free, and he wasn't sure he wanted to find out what strings might be attached. As he tightened the bolts on an old pickup truck, the sound of tires crunching on gravel caught his attention. He looked up to see the same sleek black sedan pulling into the lot. His stomach tightened. Sophia Bennett was back. She stepped out of the car, looking just as polished as the day before, but this time there was a different air about her. She wasn't the frazzled, panicked woman he'd met yesterday. Today she carried herself with confidence, her sharp blazer and calm demeanor making it clear she was here on business. "Morning, Jake," she said, her voice steady but friendly. Jake wiped his hands on a rag, eyeing her cautiously. "Morning. Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Sophia smiled faintly. "I figured you might have some questions about the check." Jake crossed his arms, leaning against the truck. "You could say that. 50 grand is a lot of money for fixing a radiator." Sophia nodded, as if she'd expected his skepticism. "It's not just about the car, Jake. It's about you." "Me?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "What about me?" Sophia took a step closer, her expression softening. "You didn't have to help me yesterday. You could have turned me away, or overcharged me, or done a half-hearted job just to get me out of your hair. But you didn't. You were honest, kind, and you did the work without expecting anything in return. That's rare these days." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's just how I was raised. You help people when you can." Sophia smiled again, this time with genuine warmth. "Exactly. And that's why I'm here." Jake frowned, unsure where this was going. "What do you mean?" Sophia gestured toward the garage, her eyes scanning the worn-out tools and the peeling paint on the walls. "This place has potential, Jake. You have potential, but you're stuck. You're working yourself to the bone just to keep the lights on, and it's not fair. You deserve better." Jake shifted uncomfortably, not used to hearing someone talk about his life like that. "Look, I appreciate the check, but I'm not a charity case." Sophia shook her head. "This isn't charity, it's an investment." Jake blinked, caught off guard. "An investment?" Sophia nodded, her tone growing more serious. "I want to help you expand this place. New equipment, better tools, maybe even hire a few extra hands. But more than that, I want to turn this garage into something bigger. A place where people in this community can come to learn, to work, to build something for themselves." Jake stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Why would you want to do that? You don't even know me." Sophia hesitated for a moment, then spoke quietly. "Because I know what it's like to struggle. My dad was a mechanic, just like you. He worked hard his whole life, but no one ever gave him a chance to do more. I couldn't help him back then, but I can help you now." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to jump at the opportunity, but another part of him was still wary. "And what do you get out of this?" he asked finally. Sophia smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "I get to see this place thrive, and maybe, just maybe, I get to prove that kindness and hard work still matter." Jake looked around the garage, imagining what it could be with her help. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think about the future, about what could be instead of what was. "Oh, all right," he said slowly. "I'm in, but on one condition." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Jake grinned. "No more surprise checks. If we're doing this, we're doing it together." Sophia laughed, extending her hand. "Deal." Jake shook her hand, feeling a strange mix of excitement and fear. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to find out. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind for Jake. True to her word, Sophia wasted no time in getting the ball rolling. Contractors came in to renovate the garage, replacing the cracked floors, repainting the walls, and installing new equipment that Jake could only dream of owning before. The once run-down shop was slowly transforming into a state-of-the-art facility, and Jake couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and disbelief every time he walked through the doors. But not everyone in the neighborhood was happy about the changes. It started with whispers. Jake noticed the way some of the other mechanics in the area looked at him when he passed by. They had always been friendly enough before, but now their smiles were tight, their nods curt. He overheard snippets of conversations, words like sellout and lucky break thrown around like accusations. At first, he tried to ignore it. He wasn't doing anything wrong, and he didn't owe anyone an explanation. But the tension only grew. One afternoon, as Jake was unloading a shipment of new tools, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Well, well, look who's moving up in the world." Jake turned to see Derek, a mechanic who ran a competing shop a few blocks away. Derek was tall and broad-shouldered, with a permanent scowl etched into his face. He'd always been competitive, but there was an edge to his tone now that Jake didn't like. "Derek," Jake said evenly, setting the box down, "what can I do for you?" Derek crossed his arms, his gaze sweeping over the newly renovated garage. "Nice setup you've got here. Must be nice having someone bankroll your little operation." Jake's jaw tightened. "I worked hard for this, Derek, just like I've always worked hard." "Sure you did," Derek said with a sneer, "but let's not pretend this is all you. Everyone knows you've got some rich lady pulling the strings." Jake took a deep breath, trying to keep his temper in check. "Sophia's helping me, yeah, but this is still my shop. My work." Derek stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You think you're better than the rest of us now, just because you've got some fancy tools and a fresh coat of paint?" Jake met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I don't think I'm better than anyone, Derek. I'm just trying to make a living, same as you." Derek stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head with a bitter laugh. "You'll see, Jake. People like her don't stick around, and when she's gone, you'll be right back where you started." With that, Derek turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing there, his fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to brush it off, to tell himself that Derek's words didn't matter, but they did, because deep down, Jake couldn't help but wonder if Derek was right. The tension didn't stop there. A few days later, Jake arrived at the shop early in the morning to find graffiti sprayed across the front wall. The words "sellout" and "traitor" were scrawled in bright red paint, the letters jagged and angry. Jake's stomach sank as he stared at the vandalism, his mind racing. He didn't need to guess who was behind it. Sophia arrived a short while later, her expression darkening when she saw the damage. "This is unacceptable," she said firmly. "We're calling the police." Jake hesitated. "I don't know if that's a good idea. It'll just make things worse." Sophia turned to him, her eyes blazing. "Jake, this isn't just about you anymore. This shop is a symbol of what we're trying to do for this community. We can't let people tear it down because they're jealous." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I get that, but these guys, they're not going to stop. Calling the cops might just escalate things." Sophia frowned, clearly frustrated, but she didn't push the issue. Instead, she made a few phone calls, arranging for the graffiti to be cleaned up and for security cameras to be installed around the property. Jake appreciated her support, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. Despite the challenges, the shop continued to grow. Customers were pouring in, drawn by the new equipment and the promise of quality work. Jake hired a couple of young apprentices from the neighborhood, giving them a chance to learn the trade and earn an honest living. For the first time in years, he felt like he was making a real difference, not just for himself, but for others. But the more successful the shop became, the more the resentment from his competitors grew. Derek and his crew started spreading rumors, telling anyone who would listen that Jake was only successful because of Sophia's money. Some customers believed the lies and stopped coming to the shop, while others showed up just to gawk at the rich man's garage. Jake tried to keep his head down and focus on the work, but the pressure was starting to wear on him. He couldn't help but wonder if he'd made a mistake by accepting Sophia's help. Maybe Derek was right. Maybe this wasn't really his success. But then he'd look at the apprentices, their faces lighting up as they learned something new, and he'd remember why he was doing this. It wasn't about proving anything to Derek or anyone else. It was about building something that mattered, something that could last. The tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point one evening when Jake was locking up the shop. The day had been long but productive, and he was looking forward to heading home for a quiet dinner. As he turned the key in the lock, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned around to see Derek and two of his crew members standing in the dim light of the street lamp, their expressions hard and unfriendly. "Evening, Jake," Derek said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Busy day? Huh?" Jake straightened, his instincts immediately on edge. "What do you want, Derek?" Derek smirked, taking a step closer. "Just thought we'd stop by and see how the Golden Boy is doing. You know, with all that fancy new equipment and your big shot investor." Jake clenched his jaw, keeping his voice calm. "If you've got something to say, just say it." Derek's smirk faded, replaced by a sneer. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Just because you've got some rich lady throwing money at you?" Jake took a deep breath, trying to keep his temper in check. "I don't think I'm better than anyone, Derek. I'm just trying to run my business." "Your business?" Derek scoffed. "This isn't your business anymore, Jake. It's hers. You're just her puppet." Jake's fists tightened at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," Derek shot back, his voice rising. "You sold out, Jake. You let her come in here and take over, and now you're acting like you're some kind of hero, but you're not. You're just a sellout." Jake stepped forward, his voice firm. "You don't know anything about me, Derek, and you don't know anything about Sophia. She's trying to help this community, and all you're doing is tearing it down." Derek's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jake thought he might throw a punch. But instead, Derek just laughed, a cold, bitter sound that sent a chill down Jake's spine. "You'll see," Derek said, his voice low and menacing. "People like her don't stick around, and when she's gone, you'll have nothing." With that, Derek turned and walked away, his crew following close behind. Jake watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd dealt with difficult people before, but this felt different. This felt personal. The next morning, Jake arrived at the shop to find the front window shattered. Glass littered the ground, and a brick lay in the middle of the floor, surrounded by shards. Jake's stomach sank as he stepped inside, his mind racing. He didn't need to guess who was behind it. Sophia arrived a short while later, her face pale with anger when she saw the damage. "This is unacceptable," she said, her voice tight. "We're calling the police." Jake hesitated, his gut telling him that involving the cops might only make things worse. "I don't know if that's a good idea," he said carefully. "Derek and his guys, they're not going to stop just because the police show up." Sophia turned to him, her eyes blazing. "Jake, this isn't just about you anymore. This shop is a symbol of what we're trying to do here. We can't let people like Derek scare us into giving up." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I get that, but I don't want this to turn into something bigger than it already is." Sophia frowned, clearly frustrated, but she didn't push the issue. Instead, she made a few phone calls, arranging for the window to be replaced and for security cameras to be installed around the property. Jake appreciated her support, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to escalate. That night, Jake stayed late at the shop, going over the books and trying to figure out how to cover the unexpected expenses. The new equipment and renovations had been a blessing, but they'd also come with higher costs. He was so focused on the numbers that he didn't hear the sound of footsteps outside until it was too late. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Smoke. His head snapped up and he saw flames licking at the edge of the garage door. Panic surged through him as he grabbed the fire extinguisher and ran outside. Someone had set a pile of rags on fire near the entrance, and the flames were spreading fast. Jake managed to put out the fire before it caused too much damage, but his hands were shaking as he stood there, staring at the charred remains. This wasn't just vandalism anymore. This was a threat. Sophia arrived minutes later, having been alerted by the security system. Her face was a mix of anger and concern as she looked at the damage. "This has gone too far," she said firmly. "We're not letting them get away with this." Jake nodded, his jaw set. "I'm done playing nice. If they want to fight, they've got one." The tension had been building for weeks, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before things came to a head. The fire outside the shop had been the final straw. He wasn't just dealing with petty jealousy anymore. This was personal, and it was dangerous. Jake had spent the last few days installing extra security measures, but deep down, he knew that wouldn't stop Derek and his crew. They wanted to send a message, and they weren't going to back down easily. It was late one night when the confrontation finally happened. Jake was locking up the shop after another long day when he heard the sound of tires screeching to a stop outside. He turned to see Derek's truck pulling up, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Derek and two of his guys jumped out, their faces set with determination. Jake's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him anymore. "Derek," Jake said, his voice steady, "what are you doing here?" Derek smirked, stepping closer. "Just thought we'd stop by and see how the Golden Boy is doing. Looks like you've been busy." Jake crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "If you got something to say it. Otherwise, get off my property." Derek's smirk faded, replaced by a sneer. "You think you're untouchable now, don't you, just because you've got her money backing you up?" "This isn't about money," Jake shot back. "This is about building something better for me, for the shop, and for this community. You don't like it? That's your problem." Derek's eyes narrowed, and he took another step forward. "You don't get it, do you? People like you don't get to win. You don't get to come in here and act like you're better than the rest of us." Jake clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. "I'm not better than anyone, Derek. I'm just trying to make a living. You want to tear me down because you're too scared to change? Fine. But I'm not going anywhere." Derek's face twisted with anger, and before Jake could react, Derek lunged at him. The two men collided, and Jake stumbled back, barely managing to stay on his feet. Derek's crew moved in, but Jake fought back, his adrenaline surging as he defended himself and his shop. The commotion drew the attention of the neighbors, and soon, people were gathering to see what was happening. Someone must have called the police because the sound of sirens filled the air moments later. Derek and his crew froze, their heads snapping toward the flashing lights as a patrol car pulled up. "Break it up," one of the officers shouted, stepping out of the car. Derek glared at Jake one last time before backing off, his hands raised in mock surrender. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice low enough that only Jake could hear. The officers quickly assessed the situation, separating the men and taking statements from witnesses. Jake explained what had happened, his voice calm despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Derek, on the other hand, was defiant, insisting that Jake had provoked him. In the end, the officers arrested Derek for trespassing and attempted assault. As they led him away, Jake felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. He'd stood his ground, but the cost had been high. Sophia arrived shortly after, her face pale with worry as she rushed to Jake's side. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes scanning him for injuries. "I'm fine," Jake said, though his voice was hoarse. "It's over." Sophia shook her head. "No, it's not. This is just the beginning. But we'll get through it together." Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to let Derek or anyone else stop him from building the life he wanted. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his future, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The days following Derek's arrest were a whirlwind of emotions for Jake. The confrontation had left him shaken, but it also brought a sense of clarity. He realized that standing up for himself and his shop wasn't just about protecting his livelihood. It was about proving to himself and the community that change was possible, even in the face of resistance. Sophia, as always, was by his side. She helped him repair the damage to the shop, both physical and emotional. The shattered window was replaced, the charred marks from the fire were scrubbed away, and the security cameras were upgraded. But more importantly, Sophia encouraged Jake to focus on the bigger picture. "This isn't just about you, Jake," she said one evening as they sat in the office going over plans for the shop's future. "What we're building here is bigger than one person. It's about giving people hope, showing them that they can rise above their circumstances." Jake nodded, her words sinking in. He'd always thought of the shop as his own little corner of the world, but now he saw it as something more, a beacon for the community. And with Sophia's help, he was determined to make it shine. The turning point came a few weeks later, when Jake and Sophia organized a community open house at the shop. They invited everyone in the neighborhood to come and see the changes, to learn about the new programs they were starting. Jake had been hesitant at first, worried that the lingering resentment from people like Derek's crew would overshadow the event, but Sophia had insisted. "People need to see what we're doing here," she said. "They need to know that this is for them too." The day of the open house, the shop was buzzing with activity. Families wandered through the newly renovated space, admiring the shiny new tools and equipment. Kids laughed as they tried their hands at simple car repairs under Jake's guidance, their faces lighting up with excitement when they succeeded. Sophia had even arranged for a local food truck to provide free meals, creating a festive atmosphere that brought the community together. Jake stood near the entrance, watching it all unfold. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of pride, not just in the shop, but in what it represented. This wasn't just a place to fix cars anymore. It was a place where people could learn, grow, and find a sense of purpose. As the day went on, Jake noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was one of Derek's former crew members, a young man named Tyler. He looked nervous, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as he lingered near the edge of the crowd. Jake approached him cautiously. "Tyler," he said, his tone neutral. "Didn't expect to see you here." Tyler shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Jake's gaze. I just wanted to see what all the fuss was about." Jake nodded, his expression softening. "Well, you're welcome here. If you're interested, we're starting a training program next month. It's open to anyone who wants to learn." Tyler looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "You'd let me join? After everything?" Jake smiled faintly. "Everyone deserves a second chance." Tyler hesitated, then nodded. "Thanks, Jake. I'll think about it." As Tyler walked away, Jake felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the shop could be a place of healing, even for those who had once been against it. By the end of the day, the open house was a resounding success. People left with smiles on their faces, and Jake received more offers of support than he could have imagined. The shop was no longer just his, it belonged to the community now, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake and Sophia stood outside the shop, watching the last of the guests leave. The neon sign above the door glowed softly, a symbol of everything they'd built together. "You did good today," Sophia said, her voice warm. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "We did good. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Sophia smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "You could have, Jake. You just didn't know it yet." Jake looked at her, his expression serious. "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they'd been through settling over them. Finally, Sophia broke the silence. "Oh, what's next?" she asked. Jake grinned, his eyes lighting up with determination. "Next, we keep building. For the shop, for the kids, for the community. This is just the beginning." Sophia nodded, her smile returning. "I like the sound of that." As they stood there, side by side, Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He had a purpose, a partner, and a community behind him, and that was more than enough. Thank you for watching this inspiring story of kindness, resilience, and the power of community. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need a little hope today. At Emma's Stories, we believe that even the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples of change. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story that inspires and uplifts. Together, let's keep spreading positivity, one story at a time. Thank you for being part of the Emma Stories family, and we'll see you in the next video.